to welcome everyone to Before You Say a Word, Developing a Communications Plan. This is a partnership of the Episcopal Church Foundation with the Episcopal Communicators, as well as Jim Naughton and Rebecca from Canticle Communications. And just a few words about ECF. We're an independent lay-led organization that strengthens the Episcopal Church through vision and planning, leadership development, and raising financial resources for ministry. And with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Melody Warman, just to say maybe a few words about Episcopal Communicators. Melody?
Great, thanks. And thanks to everyone who's on this. I apologize for the golden glow on my webcam. I'm right by a incandescent light bulb. Episcopal Communicators is an association of communication professionals across the Episcopal Church from many different organizations, parishes, dioceses, and we are here to be supportive of your ministries and to advocate for the ministry of communication within the church. If you are not currently a member, I'd invite you to go to our website, episcopalcommunicators.org, and go check it out. Membership is $75 for a calendar year, and it gets you lots of benefits and connection with what I think is the greatest organization in the Episcopal Church. So if you have any questions, you can send me a direct chat or just be in touch.
Great. Thanks,
Miguel.
Melody. Certainly. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jim Naughton of Canticle. And Jim, please introduce yourself and crew.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Naughton. I'm one of the two partners of Canticle Communications, and my partner, Rebecca Wilson, will introduce herself in just a minute. The slide you see is the full breadth of the Canticle Communications empire. Kathleen Moore, our communications manager, is on the left, and Crystal Plummer is next to Rebecca there, and she is our project manager. And Lou Leone, who is on the right-hand side of your screen, is one of our writers. We've been around 7 years as of, I guess, this week, next week maybe. And we didn't design it this way, but we work almost exclusively in the Episcopal Church. We haven't always done that, but that is where we're at. My own background is in journalism. I was a reporter at the New York Times and the Washington Post. I was a sports writer for a while. I covered the Mets for the New York Daily News back when they won the World Series in the 80s. And then, like so many Major League Baseball writers before me, took a job in communications in the Episcopal Church. Just that well-worn career path there. But before I did that, I was involved in a lot of online startups like BeliefNet back when it was a more multi-faith thing. And so I came to this with sort of a strong editorial background and almost no organizational skills whatsoever. And no sense of how to sort of move organizations either. And lo, I met Rebecca Wilson, and she can tell you about herself.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Wilson. Can everybody hear me okay? We didn't test my audio. Yeah?
Yes.
Yes? Great, thank you. So I'm Rebecca Wilson. I'm one of those other people you see in the picture on the screen, and part of the team at Canticle Communications. And as Jim alluded, my background is in community-based work, so advocacy in public and communications for public libraries and for children's health initiatives and for LGBT equality and lots of other kinds of community and neighborhood organizing, local, state, regional efforts. So we come at this with both a sense of mass communications and journalism, but also a sense of the reality of doing this kind of work to move people on the ground in communities. So hopefully the blend of those two sets of experiences will be helpful to you in what we have to present in the next hour.
I have been asked to say a prayer. Well, before I do that, I should say we are the authors of this book. And there this book is, and if you're interested in it, it's easy to find.
It was published by Church Publishing, and they would certainly want us to say that.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I have been asked to say a prayer, and instead of doing that strictly, I wanted to read a very short passage from 1 Corinthians 9. And this is Paul, obviously, writing. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law so I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people that I might by all means save some. I don't know that I have ever saved anyone, and we aren't urging you to become all things to all people. But if even St. Paul understood the importance of speaking to an audience in terms that they could understand, in motifs that resonated with them, using arguments that they were familiar with from their daily lives, then one of the things we like to suggest is that it's incumbent on us to do the same. We're going to break our presentation tonight into 3 parts, and I just want to mention what they are. And there will be, at the end, we'll do a more open sort of, there'll be pauses at various points for questions. But at the end, we'll have a conversation about next steps, and that will be sort of open more broadly. As Miguel and Brendan have mentioned, you can also type questions into the chat box, and excuse me, whichever of us isn't talking might be typing. So the 3 parts are strategic questions, so that you sort of know what you're about to undertake, and then a conversation about your team and your tools. Do you have any help? Can you get any help? What sort of resources do you have? Those are important answers to have before you figure out, well, we're going to do this kind of website, or, we're going to do this kind of video. And then what we find is that you can have all this conversation and have all these answers, but you don't really know how this all goes until you try to put it on a calendar and figure out what the workflow is actually going to be like. And so that's the 3rd part of the presentation. And I'll just start by saying that everything we're going to talk about is rooted in the idea that communications is evangelism. We don't have in the New Testament Jesus standing up before the Sermon on the Mount, and nobody stands up first and gives the acolyte schedule. We don't have people just sort of piling on one detail after another about what kind of meetings there are going to be or what time people should show up for stuff. What we have is the message. What we have is the good news, and sometimes it's in parables and sometimes it's in narratives, but we're communicating something more important than what we refer to as a prose calendar, which is not to say that the prose calendar is not important too. People do need to show up. You want your acolytes on time. But if that's all you're doing, maybe we need to think more broadly. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between strategy and tactics, so we can actually have a conversation about strategy. They are not the same thing, but they are sometimes used interchangeably. We say that we run a strategic communications firm, and people sometimes, particularly people who are still journalists, say, well, what makes us strategic? Isn't that just like a fancy word to throw around? And honestly, there are many things that sort of make it strategic, but one of them is to say, what do you want to happen? What after you do this, what are you hoping for? That's a strategic question, right? That's not a tactical question. It's not a question about whether things should be red or blue. It's not a question about whether you should use Georgia typeface or Arial typeface. It's none of those things, right? So strategy is your plan to tell your story. Tactics are the things you do to carry that story out. We have talked about, in the past, we've told a story what we like to tell about the tragedy of the Trifold brochure. And I won't regale you with the whole thing, but it was basically a plan that someone wanted us to execute to use a brochure with a tear-off mailing label to try to get college students to come to a 9 a.m. Eucharist. And you could have done a beautiful brochure, right? And it would not have mattered at all because you would have chosen the wrong way to go about the business. You aren't going to reach college students with a brochure. You're not going to reach them with a tear-off thing that you send them snail mail at. You're not going to get them to come to something at 9 in the morning most of the time on a weekend. And so all these larger questions had not been answered. And if we don't answer the larger questions, we can't really no matter what we create, it can fail. So we want to not do that if we can avoid it. You've seen the slide here. What you want to ask yourself is, we're going to tell people this. We're going to say it to a particular audience, and then we are hoping that they will do the following. Now, I should say that you will have occasion where what you want to do is say, come to this thing we're doing to your parish and your neighborhood, and you will hope that they will do it. That's certainly something that we all do. We all do it all the time. It's meat and potatoes, in our business in certain ways. However, to step back and put this again into the context of evangelism, what you're also often doing is asking people just if they will have a conversation with you, or just if you come to them, will they respond? So it's not all about putting butts in seats, or it's not all about making sure that people return their pledge envelopes or things like that. It's not all kind of, please do the following, thank you. Sometimes it's, please take a walk with us that we don't quite know where it will take us. So that's something I want to make sure we have said, because church communities form in different ways now and behave in different ways than they did when people at almost 60 than when we were growing up. So anyway, tactics are a different matter. Tactics are those questions about typeface. Tactics are a matter of capturing your impression of your community, making it into a visual impression, so that when people come to your website, they see, oh, this is sort of a loose and funky place where my screaming kids would be right at home. Or this is a place that takes a very reverential approach to its high church liturgy. Or this is a place that doesn't have a lot materially, but is out there doing hands-on work all the time. You want to create some sort of visual identity. You want to speak in a certain tone of voice. You want to make sure that when you are getting ready to say something, that the person that people can hear it from best is the one who's talking, right? So for instance, if it's something about your church school, you can have the rector talk about your church school. You can have the head of the church school talk about the church school. But it's not rectors who are going to be putting their children into your church school. It's parents. And so it's quite possible that having a parent who is not associated with the school other than having children in it is the best messenger. So these sorts of questions, these are the tactical questions. So strategy is what you're trying to make happen and how you plan to do it. And then tactics have to do with your execution. So let us do some strategy. One of the first questions we ask people to ask is who are they? And this is not just a matter of like, well, who's speaking? But it's a question of saying, what are the values that we want to put out there? The next part of the equation is, who are we talking to? You can't make assumptions about this anymore. For one thing, the kinds of folks who now are interested in church are interested for so many different reasons that you just can't generalize. the other reason you can't make these assumptions is that it's not that hard to find out who your potential audience is. It's easy in the church these days. I mean, people always talk about how, oh, people drive past 3 or 4 other Episcopal churches to come to my church. Well, maybe the people who are right around your door are driving someplace else, right? So we don't necessarily know who the audiences are and why they're responding to us, and we need to get better information on that to speak to people. Another question that we have to ask is just how we want people to respond, and this is a place where we really need to be honest with ourselves. What are our resources? We don't want to set ourselves up for failure by assuming that we can do more than we can, right? And so we have to be honest. We have to say, how much time does the person working on this have to put into it? What skills do they have? Do we have budget to supplement their skills? Because not everybody can have all of the skills. So there are financial questions, and there are questions about whether we can get volunteers involved in this. I mean, we've worked with the parish recently that just because of where it's located, the city and its location within the city, there are communications professionals there. And so if you can get some of their time, then, you know, it's like, I grew up in a Catholic parish, and it's, you know, the fact that there was a roofer in the parish was great when the church roof was leaking, right? Because you could get a deal on that. Well, this is sort of the high-tech version of that in some ways, or the high-scale economy version of that, because if you have volunteers, even if they are hit and miss in terms of reliability, you can sometimes find ways to use them. Now, the questions that we like to have people think about in terms of establishing their own identity, what we try to save you from is if there's not an agreement on the values you're trying to create, the values you're trying to espouse, if there's not an agreement on the kind of image you're trying to create, then every time you sit down to make a flyer or write a note or, you know, put out a newsletter, those questions are open, right? And so every time somebody might say, oh, we should do it this way, we should do it this way, you can get all this information from, you know, everybody's got an opinion on what they like and what they think would work. And if you're the person who has to execute this, then you have to have that conversation fresh just about every time you start, right? That'll make you nuts. So we don't want that. So we want to draw on agreed upon statements of your values. It might be the mission statement. The mission statement itself might be incredibly vague and almost useless as a statement of what you're about. It might be indistinguishable from the mission statement of the 9 other parishes within, you know, a 10-mile radius. But you went through a process to get there, and there was conversation about, you know, why you want to say those particular words. And if you can get access to that stuff, you can kind of know how the parish has spoken about itself. Another way at this is if you've done a recent strategic plan. And honestly, if none of that is in place, you might just want to say, look, can we have a vestry meeting where I can ask some of these questions? Because I don't want to make this up on my own. And then if we get pushback on it, you know, suddenly, oh, why did you say those words? You should have said something else. But you do need something so that this question, you just don't want, every time you open up a Word document, you don't want to have to say, okay, are we a parish that is, you know, sort of very lively and outgoing and et cetera? Or are we committed to crafting, you know, making disciples in an atmosphere of reflection? And because you'll say different things. You will go for a different tone of voice. You'll go for a different typeface, different color scheme. All these things are up for grabs until you get some sense of the identity that you want to put across. Now, you want to have a good sense of who you are, but you want to understand, too, that if the people to whom you're, if nothing about that identity you have just crafted resonates with your audience, then you have problems. So you want to have a sense of who your audiences are. Now, obviously, the first audience we'll talk about is who's the audience we hear from? Who are the people that if we don't do it right, give us a hard time? Who are the stakeholders who say, look, my meeting needs to be publicized, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to have internal audiences for sure. The people who help make your church run and the people who you want to show up for the events. You know, the people who will be disappointed if they don't get news about when something's happening. But you also have an external audience who might, I mean, for these people at first, you know, letting them know that you have an 11 o'clock service just means that, you know, this thing that they didn't come to at 9, you're doing again with music later in the day, right? And so they have they want different kinds of information. You want to approach them with different things, different opportunities. So you probably need to use different tools to do that. I mean, an obvious example, you cannot send your e-newsletter to people whose email address you don't have. You can't mail people whose snail mail address you don't have. So if you're thinking about communications as evangelism, you have to think about ways of reaching people who you can't currently reach. A couple of ways to do that are simply, I used to be, you know, as I said, a reporter, and one of the things, there was this feature for a while at the Washington Post that we all hated to do called Where We Live, and it was basically a neighborhood profile, but there was no news in it. So you were just sort of sent to an area, and it appeared in when I don't know if they still have a real estate section, but at the time it appeared in the real estate section. And you would just go to a neighborhood and find out about its history and its commerce and its schools and things like that. And then you'd somehow try to, you know, you'd interview some people, you'd try to make a story out of it. That kind of shoe leather reporting is actually very useful in getting to know the neighborhood around your church, right? Getting out and seeing traffic patterns, foot traffic patterns, what people do on weekends, all that sort of stuff, it's important. So, okay, another way to do it is explore data. You have from Miguel some data. These slides, so this slide is going to be basically useless for you. But here are 4 links that you have access to that can help you know how to get information that will tell you the income levels, the education levels, the demographics of folks around your church.
And
right?
Jim, if I could just jump in, for those who have signed on since we started, just the web links are on near where the green arrow is, just to the left of that. You can download that file, or they're right here in the web links box.
And what they are, there are a couple of things that the church has done, and there are a couple of things, there's something from the Census Department, and then this is something that draws on census data. And you can sculpt this for your neighborhood, you can sculpt it for your diocese, you can make it work. So what we like to advise people, sorry, Rebecca, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we've lost a graphic here. Go ahead, Jim, and if we keep losing more graphics, we'll figure out what to do about that.
And you might have guessed what the graphic was. It was a Venn diagram. So what we're trying to say is, one circle of this Venn diagram is you, and the other circle is the folks who you hope to reach. And for purposes of evangelism, you're likely to have the best success at the overlap of where things you have to offer or things you are interested in intersect with needs and interests in your diocese. It's a sort of an operational way for a community of talking about that pretty well-known Frederick Buckner quote about, you know, your vocation is where your joy meets the needs of the world, or something like that. Anyway, you can all, you probably have browsers open, you can look up Frederick Buckner and find that quote, but it's about the nature of vocation. So
let me just say that an example of that might be, you know, if you do that demographic research and you figure out that the established neighborhoods in your community are beginning to turn over with folks retiring and younger folks with families moving in, and your parish happens to have a really active moms group on Tuesday morning, then it may be that the first thing you're leading with in your external communications is not church on Sunday morning. It might be that it's the moms group, because that's where you see the overlap. At our own parish here in Akron, Ohio, our community meal program on the last 2 Wednesday evenings of each month is growing much faster than our Sunday morning worship, because our community is in a place where people need to get a hot meal and where people need to be able to take groceries home. And that's our place of forming relationships. That's our overlap of Venn diagram. And as time goes on and we build those relationships, people begin to come to church on Sunday morning, but we don't lead establishing our relationship with people who are hungry by telling them that they can come to church at 10:30 on Sundays. So that's a sense of how that diagram can work after you've done some demographic and maybe community organizing work about who's in your community, and then figured out where that overlap might be with your identity and who you already are and what you're already doing.
Excuse me. We moved from Venn diagrams.
You okay?
Bank robbery. Yeah, I'm just, so Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, allegedly was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. So when you're thinking about communications, you need to be where the people you're trying to reach are, and you need to have some understanding of their lives before you can realistically hope to have a significant conversation with them. So I think we'll stop now for questions about that part, and I will mute myself and cough a little bit.
Sure. So as Jim just mentioned, and we're just going to pause for a moment. If anyone has clarification questions of this sort of strategic component, please type them into the chat box on the lower right-hand side of the screen. We'll just wait a moment. And I see a few folks are chatting, are typing.
We did take that at a bit of a gallop, so I'm happy to answer questions.
So the first question I see, is my audio on, Miguel?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the first question I see is Meredith. My church recently formed a communications group. In your experience, how can a group like this get to the strategy? Should it happen at the vestry level? I do think it's really important to have the vestry involved in the strategy, and especially in that articulation of what the identity of the congregation or the diocese or whatever is, and how to articulate that, because certainly if the communication strategy is not closely aligned with the overall strategy for the congregation, that's going to be a problem. And one of the ways we see that happen sometimes is that congregations will come up with great communications campaigns, and then people get to the church having heard about the church and decide that they want to be a part of it, and they come to be a part of it, and the experience that they have is nothing like the experience that the communication strategy, the communications plan told them they would have. So we want to keep those things really closely aligned. In our experience, communications committees and working with vestries can be really helpful in those those high-level strategy questions. Once you get down to the tactical stuff, what color are things going to be? Who's going to post Facebook on Tuesdays? Who's going to do it on Sundays? And more tactical things like that, you really want to have just a very few people involved in figuring out those tactical questions, because otherwise you end up with a whole big communications committee kind of making decisions by vote, and it doesn't work out all that well. So keep the committee aligned with the vestry and keep it focused on strategy. That would be our advice.
We have a question from Megan Siwak.
Yeah, Meredith says too many cooks, and that's exactly the problem that we want to help you avoid.
Yeah. Megan's question is, if your church is currently in a process of discerning mission, strengths, et cetera, how can the communications team operate most effectively to support that? You know, I think the answer is the questions that you need to develop a communications plan, they're not different than, I mean, in some ways they are assessments of strength. And so, I mean, one of the things we stress a lot is communicators should not allow themselves to be treated like clerks with software skills, and they should not allow themselves to be treated as though they're the communications concierge. Basically that, you know, people come to you, or you're a short order cook, people come to you and say, oh, I need a brochure, give me that. It's important to be involved in the beginning with the kind of questions that you need answers to. Because if your church has a strength and no way to communicate it, it's not actually a strength. You can't have strengths that no one knows about in church. That's just a little, you know, that's not like a nice little treasure for the congregation, but it's not a strength. And so really being integrated into the process and being the people who insist on fact-finding, because you're going to need a certain amount of data about your audience to shape your plans. And so being the people who insist on more facts, deeper facts is another way at that.
I'd say that's part of the reason that we emphasize all the time that communications is evangelism, and that we really urge you to think of it in those terms too, because you would never leave evangelism until the last step in a process. You would never leave evangelism outside the vestry meeting. You would never decide that was the thing that you could do that was optional if you had time. People think all of those things about websites or social media or putting an ad in the paper or whatever it is, whatever the tools you are that you need to use. But no Christian could ever say evangelism is the thing we do if we happen to get an extra minute. So take a seat at the table as evangelists in those strategic conversations. Cliff, your question.
Hi, Cliff.
I'm sorry?
I just said hi to Cliff. I was remembering the Northern California vestry or clergy conference.
Right. So Cliff asked, how do you evaluate multiple visions of strategy, especially in a changing culture? For example, resolving generational differences and expectations and ways to communicate. That's a really good question, too. I think that's one of the reasons that we emphasize the importance of figuring out who the audience is that you want to be speaking to. Often you will have to do sort of use multiple communications tools for multiple audiences, and that's particularly true in congregations where you have perhaps an older demographic who is less technologically comfortable. That's not always the case, but it can be. But that the audience that you really want to be reaching out to as evangelists is a younger audience that is using different channels to communicate. So if you could get really clear on who your audiences are, and then the tools that are best going to reach those audiences. You don't want the Trifold brochure for the college students, right? You don't want Snapchat for the grandparents. So an acknowledgement that everybody is going to want different tools, but you really need to focus on who your most important audiences are. There's a difference between the communications that you do for evangelism and the communications that you have to do sometimes for pastoral care. And that's a really important distinction to have too. If you've got folks, you know, who are not going to adopt any new communications and are not going to look at communications as evangelism, that can be an issue. But that's a pastoral care issue. It's not a church growth issue.
Right. So nobody stopped making phone calls. In the day when not everybody had a telephone, nobody said, oh, well, none of us can use the telephone for parish communications then. You found instead a way to get that information to the people who didn't have phones. Same thing now with different technologies.
Great.
So Sue, is it Sue? Sue? Question. We have a fairly complicated system, parish, preschool, and campus ministry. One of our struggles is how to integrate the visions into a cohesive strategy. I think we're going to get to a little bit of that in the next couple sections, but come back to that if we don't get at it in the way that we're talking about putting the plan together.
Great.
So this part of our conversation is going to be about tools, your tools and your team. And the slide we've got up now is, I would say, this is our notion of what, if everybody could do this and no more than this, we'd all be at a decent baseline. Obviously, you know, we've got, I don't know, 50 or so folks on this call. You're all in different contexts, and the tools that you're going to want to use for your audiences may be different than this. However, it's our sense in general that having a website that is the hub of your communications, the place where people can encounter you and can get a fairly comprehensive sense of you, that should be your website. You want one place where everything is available in one spot. However, to make your parish run, you're going to need to regularly communicate certain kinds of information with the involved audience, and email newsletters tend to be the best for that. If you've got a history of using paper newsletters, and it would be a massive culture shift to get away from that, then okay, I guess, but it's still good to have the core of that stuff online, and not least because you can't share it on social media and start to reach other folks who you don't have addresses for, or in whose hands you cannot put that bulletin. Then you can't do that if all of your information's on paper. But if you think of the paper as supplemental, or if you think of print as something you use strategically for like particular kinds of invitations, that sort of thing, rather than as a way of getting people news, then you begin to see, how to make an effective use of print. But this is because I don't think we have time to sort of, in this, to walk through every possible way you can communicate with your folks. It's just our sense that this lays out a pretty decent sense of, look, you post something on the website, you include it in the e-newsletter that you send maybe once a week, always at a certain time, or always on a certain day, so people get used to receiving it then, but not receiving too many emails from you. And then you harvest the link so that you can use it on social media. Social media, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Rebecca.
I was just going to say, I'll say too that this kind of flow can help you put a timetable together and a weekly rhythm together. We do this with our diocesan clients. The deadline for any new news to come in, this is just an example, is 5 o'clock on Tuesday. Wednesday needs to be the day where we focus on getting the website updated, laying out the e-news, making sure that everything, all the details are solid in what's going to go in the e-news. And then if there's a printed bulletin, that gets picked up from what's going in the e-news, and we know that's going to go out first thing Thursday morning or something like that. But that kind of rhythm of news comes in, news gets updated on the website, news gets dumped into the e-news, the printed bulletin follows from that, and then social media, once the newsletter's done, that can give a rhythm to your team. It can make sure everybody knows not only what their job is, but when they're most likely to need to do it. And it also helps you reinforce a deadline schedule to say, hey, this is our workflow. There is no such emergency thing as an emergency, Advent workshop. If I don't have it by 5 o'clock on Tuesday, it's not happening. So hopefully this can help regularize things in a way that gives you some time to do something other than these basics. And we're about to start talking about that.
Yeah. And social media would be its own whole webinar, but if you're just saying, look, I can't do everything, there's too much, do Facebook. The potential audience, I am a very heavy Twitter user. I feel like I've had a lot of good success, particularly in establishing media relations and community relations using Twitter. But if you just want to know, like, how many people am I reaching, your reach opportunities on Facebook far exceed any of the other social media. Now, you may be working with particular audiences that you're going to have better luck with something very specific. That might be Pinterest if your audience is, women between the ages of, say, just out of college and into their late 40s. If that's your audience, you might do better on Pinterest. But you'd want to do research on your audience and then on the various social media platforms. If you have time to do that, it's great. But if you don't have time to do that, and people say, well, you got to do social media, Facebook is so much the biggest platform that it's not a hard answer.
And then after Facebook, you can figure out, do you have a Twitter audience, or is there a reason you want to be in touch with community leaders or media that you want to be on Twitter, or do you have an Instagram audience? Beyond that, you probably don't have to go too deep, but you want to be on Facebook and then figure out whether Twitter or Instagram is a good fit, both for your skills, your time, and your audience.
Yeah, and we have a whole workshop on how to use Twitter for media relations, but this isn't that. So let me talk now. I mean, we just said, oh, you can do this, and you should do that, and you should do this. And very many people in the Episcopal Church are one-person shops. And very many people in the Episcopal Church who are doing communications are one-person shops with 3 other jobs, or 8 hours to do this. Or they work in a circumstance where everybody around them knows how to work in an organization, but nobody around them really knows how to work in an organization that has daily or weekly deadlines. So there are all these issues that you're facing. And so a pie in the sky kind of, oh, here are the 8 communications things you'll do, that's not useful, right? You have hard decisions to make and possibly questions to answer about how you'll spend money or how you'll spend your time. So what we try to do is, first of all, make sure that you're in a position to make the point that communications is evangelism, and that evangelism is a primary task of the church. Rebecca has mentioned this earlier, but I really want to reinforce it, because if you're competing for resources, you're always going to lose out. If you're just saying, well, we're the people who tell you where to show up, you're always going to lose out then to the people who say, well, we're the ones who are doing the mission of the church, or we are the ones who are, we need 10 more paid singers because worship is the fullness of the church's identity, blah, 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 right? If all you're doing is a prose calendar, you're always going to lose the budget battle in that case. You're always going to lose the struggle to be taken seriously. So stressing this is just really important. And once you have a sense of, look, I have this amount of money, I can do certain number of things myself, I have somebody who can help me with these 1 or 2 other things we might be able to do, then you can say to yourself, okay, that means that we have a bare bones website. I mean, perhaps you end up saying, we have a bare bones website. We get decent pictures taken maybe 3 times a year and freshen things up then. Our Facebook presence is basically going to be, me posting a question about what people need, what would you like us to pray for this week? I mean, you can do a number of these things effectively for little money and with not too much time if you're ruthless about it. If you just say, look, these are the kind of things that we can manage. And that will help you when people come in and say, oh, we have to do this, we have to do this. Because the worst thing you can do if you are working with limited resources is be in a position or have the kind of temperament that requires you to chase every rabbit that crosses the lawn. And there's the rabbit, and you should not chase it. So let me say a little bit about sort of minimal skills, right? There are certain things that we'd all love to have, but there are certain things it's hard to get along without. You have to be able to write clearly. You have to be able to edit the copy of other people who don't maybe write so clearly. This is endemic in the church. People theologize announcements about bake sales, and you need to tell people where it is and when it is, right? And then you need some technical skill. You got to be able to feed a website. You have to know the very basic stuff about cutting and pasting URLs into social media to keep that working. And it's hard to get by without an e-newsletter. And so the ability to do that rather than just run a listserv is pretty important. So that's just sort of starter set skills, but you can go a long way with these. I mean, honestly, even though the nature of communications has changed quite a bit, good writing, even if it's quite brief, makes an enormous, enormous amount of difference. So those are sort of, okay, you got to be able to do this. But there's a lot of exciting opportunities out there, right? And you want your stuff to look good. You want to make the best use of images. Everybody wants to do videos, even though, you know, most folks don't have the capacity to edit them, even if they're able to shoot them. And so this is where you really need to kind of figure out, okay, if I need good images and I have a budget, a photography budget of $100, or if I need good images and I have no photography budget, but there are 3 people who, from being friends with them on Facebook, I can see take, you know, plausibly usable photographs. Well, then that's my photography strategy, right? My photography strategy is, how can I get the most out of this $100? How can I get photos that I can use over and over and over again? So it's probably not Christmas and it's probably not Easter, because those are very dated right away, not Palm Sunday. But some big event where there's a lot of people, right? That's a way of thinking about photography. Similarly, you may have somebody who does video in the parish if you don't feel comfortable in that medium, but, you know, they have a life, they have a job, they don't necessarily want to do their job for you after they're finished doing it for their employer, but maybe once or twice a year they'll do something for you. Well, if you can sync that up with an important parish event or the pledge drive, you know, you can find a way to use that skill the 1 or 2 times they'd be willing to give it to you. So you're either in a position to supplement your own skills of having to recruit help or hire help. And you'll know your situation best to try to figure out, well, can I do either of those things? Which will come easiest.
This can also be a really good way to help keep a communications committee focused, because if you know you need a certain set of skills and you've got that checklist, then the folks who are on the committee can offer what they're really good at, and everybody has a specific job, and everybody can see how their work can coordinate with the whole, rather than everybody needing to have an opinion about what shade of blue should go, you know, on the pledge drive this year. So this list of skills can help you focus volunteers in a way that's going to be helpful to everybody.
Do folks have questions about this? I mean, this is really a nuts and bolts area of doing this work. I can see people are typing.
Yeah, people are typing. And we wait in anticipation.
One thing I'll say about this is that sometimes, particularly for photographs, if they're not going to be used in print, making the taking of the photos like a parish-wide event can be worthwhile. You know, like, hey, let's all do this, and then you know, then you can show them all because you are not making any claim. You know, you can have Flickr on your site or whatever,